Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this week's edition of Faith to Faith. Today I have Robert Papini from the International Association of Religious Freedom, for Religious Freedom, as well as somebody who's no stranger to Elevate TV, Sheikh Amin Evans, who is known to us all for his erudite interventions on several programs. But today's issue that I'm going to put to my colleagues is the issue of religious freedom. When we have discussions between different faiths, religious freedom is one of those issues which one would assume that everybody from a faith-inspired background would hanker for, would fight for, would argue for. I'm going to start with Robert and the situation in terms of your campaigning or your organization and why it was set up. And actually also, what does religious freedom mean to you?
Okay, I'll take the first one first, if I may. IRF goes back earlier than any of the current interfaith outfits. In a sense, we are what I like to call the dowager of the group, 1901, and really the first effort by anyone in the West to institutionalize the idea that faiths need to be in dialogue. And well, since then, it has been a slightly schizophrenic experience, I think, in that deciding between whether one focuses on interfaith or gives what the name suggests, religious freedom, the priority, hasn't really been resolved. And it's an ongoing question for the membership. My own involvement, I think I have to mention at this point that I am not, I am a member of staff. I'm just an administrator of the association, so I don't speak in any capacity in any kind of representative way for them. But my interest in it comes really from experiences I had in Africa to do with the need for this kind of thing to be happening now in the plural age. I was lucky enough to go to the Sudan as a teacher in the early 80s. In 1983, Jafar Nimeri, I don't know if your memory goes back.
Yes, yes, indeed it does.
Introduced Sharia law. And the tiny little town I was in the middle of nowhere, they took this very seriously and started rounding up all the women of the local Dinka people, who are actually turned out to be the backbone of the SPLA in the civil war that followed the end of Nimeri. The women were rounded up because they brewed African beer as the staple food, really, of the people, you know, the non-Muslim African villagers of this region. They were rounded up and they were flogged publicly. And I was very strongly impressed by this because the local Muslim guys in the school that I was teaching at were really very nice people. They were such hospitable, true Muslims. And to see their attitude change in the way it did on this issue, you know, I would confront them and say, look, this can't be right. These are old ladies who are making a few, literally, pennies a day, doing what their tradition involves, you know, basically nourishing their people. Oh no, the Sharia is very clear on what has to happen, you know, and they were flogged quite severely. I later went to South Africa as a researcher just after the end of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment, and was very lucky again to be researching an African church, a Zulu speakers church, which had a very hard time establishing itself on account of obviously mission Christianity, you know, the old mission church's hostility. That you know, no African church could really be anything to be taken seriously. African founded church, any African reading of the Bible could be taken seriously, and this attitude was found also among you know, African Christians, not just a white attitude, but an attitude of these people were backward, and you know, they chose actually not to cut their hair. The church, they named themselves after the so-called cult of the Nazarite in the Old Testament, Book of Numbers, which says you don't cut your hair. So they ended up looking like Rastafarians. And this was, the last word in backsliding, kind of false Christianity, etc. So as kids in the schools, they would be persecuted. And I did, the research on this, and again, I was so impressed that there needs to be a wider kind of discussion of faith as a whole. Yeah.
I think both of the examples you've raised are absolutely fascinating and challenging, actually, because they're examples of perhaps where religion itself can be an oppressor or an oppressive force, and people's interpretation of their religions, it seems, is at the heart of that. And people who, at one stage, as you mentioned, were very, very lovely people, hospitable, generous in the Nimiri era, suddenly become very dangerously violent and intolerant. Sheikh, I mean, this is something which strikes at a question I'm going to raise, because our audience, obviously, largely we're Muslims, and although we have a wide audience, let's stick on the self-critique, the critique of Muslims and our attitudes, and the difference between perhaps what we say and what we do. Qawl, fi'l. These are two concepts which we are very well known within theological circles. What you say and what you do must match. All too often, it does seem that in the real world, when we say we are Muslims, what we do doesn't seem to be very Muslim in its nature. This in turn confuses people who meet Islam for the first time in the guise of the individual, and they automatically assume that Islam is what those Muslims are practicing or doing. So in a way, Muslims themselves could be seen to be quite major failures in terms of expressing the true essence of what Islam is. Indeed, most people following faiths could be deemed to be pretty bad ambassadors of the actual ideals and values that we express. But in the area of religious freedom, Muslims in this day and age especially have an issue around this. We've seen the rise of takfirism, which is the most virulent form of non-tolerance within the Islamic fold, if you like. But there are strains of it within all of us, it could be argued. Let's try to unpick that, because I did ask Robert to talk about the definition of religious freedom. Let's start with, first of all, the definition of religious freedom from an Islamic perspective, and then to go on and maybe analyse some of the reasons why quite often we're not that orientated towards allowing religious freedom.
We don't have to look very far into the Quran to find a clear statement of freedom of religion with Surah Al-Kafirun. This, it's clear. You believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe. You go your way, I'll go my way, and Allah will be the judge on us. So we can take this simply, that if people aren't harming us, aren't harming our community or faith, then we have no reason to interfere with what they believe, if that's what they choose to believe. We can further go to Hadith, that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam famously said, I believe in an Allah who has granted me free will to the point that I can choose to sin. Now, if you can choose to sin, you can also, with perfect legality, choose to believe in the wrong thing, or believe in whatever you choose to believe. And so, fundamentally, we don't have to declare people non-believers. And we should consider that people, great scholars of different schools like Ibn Hanbal and even Ibn Taymiyyah, said that even if you see someone doing a manifest act of disbelief, it's less problematic to stay quiet than it is to accuse him of being a non-Muslim. And we can extend that across to other faiths. Once we purify our intra-faith attitude, then we see that this applies to the world, that we are supposed to be the caliphs of this world, caring for the whole of creation, not trying to bully creation into a particular mindset that suits my individual interpretation of it.
Okay, yeah, your follow-up point.
My follow-up point is that we are not in a finished product. When at Qadir will come, the verse is revealed saying to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, this day we have completed your deen. It's completed for Prophet Muhammad. He's the point that we aim to of conduct, thinking and spirituality. We're all on a journey. We haven't got complete Islam within our heads and minds. I've been studying Quran for around 20 years. I wouldn't claim to know a verse fully. So my journey continues. Who am I on this journey to turn to somebody else and say, I know where you should be going?
That's really interesting, because you've just interpreted that verse, which is very commonly known to Muslims, about the completion of the faith. And you've put what would be a very comfortable spin for me in terms of saying, well, actually, this is the Prophet, peace be upon him, who has had the faith completed for him.
I should add, there were others who had complete faith in that statement. And of course, the Prophet, peace be upon him, holds up the hand of the person whose faith is also completed.
Yeah, of course, Imam Ali alayhi salam is singled out within that instance. But yeah, that's a fascinating entree you've made. It takes me to 2 or 3 verses. La ikra fid din. There is no compulsion in religion. Very commonly quoted, absolutely clear cut within the Quranic verses. Actually, there is no compulsion in religion. You mentioned the verse from Al-Kafirun, Surah Al-Kafirun. It seems that there's a very clear-cut, unambiguous freedom of individuality, freedom of expression, so long as you're not violating others' rights, perhaps. In a gregarious society, justice and the rights of others counterbalance freedom. Absolute freedom. I'm sure that, Robert, you wouldn't espouse absolute freedom per se.
No, indeed, no. There obviously has to be a debate at some point when you're discussing tolerance about the limits of it, and this is something that I think has happened recently in even the Unitarian family, who like to believe that they can embrace most things. Similarly, in Japan, when we had the terrible Asahara, Yoko Asahara, was it? The subway sarin gas attacks. That, I think, was the kind of breaking point for Japanese society. We have a strong membership in Japan, and they constitute mostly groups that haven't found a place within the mainstream, the Japanese establishment. So they are sort of relatively new religions, so-called. But
so these parameters of freedom within the Unitarian thinking, they're there as well. There is
oh, very definitely, yes. Now we have breakaways and splinters happening within the Unitarian family that are not countenanced as legitimate by certainly to my knowledge, the UUA in America likes to crack down on that. I guess, religion does have this property of fissiparity, I think they call it, a tendency for private opinions to gain some traction in some corner of the population and issue a challenge. It's an observed property of religion in the anthropology of religion, the history of religions. We can't deny it. And you are going to have a fight back from those who have cornered resources, I suppose, have sealed or solidified doctrine and so forth.
So this is it. The religion invariably seems to veer towards institutionalization, whether it's with the complicity of existing rulers or simply because the public demands it. clarity of dogma and doctrine because they want things in black and white and they don't want to have to work things out for themselves. There is a natural tendency for most of the major faiths to establish institutions. Once institutions are established, they dictate the parameters of what freedom is in religion and not necessarily the people. That's one area I'm going to touch on. But before that, Amr bil Maruf wa Nahi anil Munkar within the Islamic ethos, again sticking to the Islamic dissection, if you like, of freedom of expression and how you engage with others once you have a faith that you believe in, which is according to your own mindset complete. It can be very easy to fall into judgmentalism. Amr bil Maruf, Nahi anil Munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. I mean, if that becomes an obligatory thing on any Muslim, somebody who professes the faith, he can take that in a couple of ways, Sheikh Amin. I mean, maybe talk us through the right use of Amr bil Maruf in relation to freedom of religion and the wrong use.
When we're talking about a manifest harm, a certain harm, then we have a duty to intervene. And this is common across law. This is a basic moral, ethical position, that if you see harm occurring to yourself or to someone else, you have a right to act with reasonable force or a reasonable response. And this is the case if we see, say, a cult that is promoting suicide as a sure path to paradise, then we have to say, no, that's not acceptable. Similarly, it's one thing for me to enjoin good and say life would be better for you if you do this. But it's something else if I say, since this is good for you, you have to do this. This is applying a syllogism to Amr bil Maruf. So we can encourage people to be good, but it doesn't become obligatory upon us to make goodness obligatory upon others.
That's the crucial difference.
It's a very big difference. Plus, that verse is qualified by many other verses in the Quran. Treat them with kindness, offer them the best of arguments, that crop up time and time again throughout the verses in our conduct to non-Muslims, people of other faiths, and, importantly, to other Muslims. Sometimes our internal debates reach disgraceful levels of vilification and mutual vilification, and it's totally unnecessary.
I mean, this is particularly common at the moment with the rise of fundamentalism. I mean, in the sense that it is used now of people who are being actually unreasonable in their belief, not in its traditional terminological, interpretation.
It has occurred within the madhabs as well, even within Shiism. At one time there was a tendency to use this as the solution to all arguments, to accuse the other person of not being a proper Muslim or not being a true follower of Ahlul Bayt. It's a cheap and a shoddy tactic in an argument. But I wanted to just touch back onto your discussion of structures. And the structures, of course, become idols. People tend to end up worshipping the structure rather than looking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of everything. And I think it was Muhammad al-Ghazali, the brother of the mystic, who said, every morning when I wake up, I destroy the idol that I built the day before. He cleansed his mind of those structures, dogmas and attitudes, that tendency in us to anthropomorphize Allah in some way. And he tried to cleanse his mind of that.
That's an interesting breakdown of what I want to get onto, which is the techniques that human beings can use in self-appraisal and self-reflection and deconstruction of those idols. The destruction and the deconstruction of idol worship that we perhaps inadvertently do when we make these sacrosanct institutional, dogmatic edifices in our own minds, in our own lives. I mean, I'm going to come back to Robert. To what extent is this also true within the Christian institutions and the institutions, other faiths that you've come across in your organisational work? Do you find the same kind of edifices being built up within those societies or religions?
Oh, I think very much so within within not just Christian or Buddhist or any, but in any religious phenomenon you will have the build-up of a hierarchy. I would like to just touch on something from my own experience that I think this answers you on, and that is a particular meditation technique that I've had experience of, and I know that lots of people have across the world, because there are free schools provided for it by a man who was actually a Singaporean businessman Burmese of Indian origin, who had the experience of having been healed by this technique, which had been preserved in Burma for many centuries, that claimed to be the original technique taught by the Buddha, Vipassana Bhavana it's called. And the idea there is that anybody from any religion can attend these training courses, which are very intensive, 10 days of straight meditation, nothing else, pure absolute silence. Which really does have a powerful effect in clearing out conceptions, preconceptions, misconceptions. And they do invite everybody. They say, please leave your religion at the door. And here we ask you not to accept any other authority than what you experience here. You are here to learn about why you do this structure building.
Sheikh Amin, without losing a lot of our audience who may be trying to grapple with this idea of questioning and critical thinking, deep critical thinking as a believer, in the Islamic fold, that deep critical thinking, is it supposed to occur in prayer? For instance, the formal canonical prayer, our 5-time daily prayer, is that supposed to be part of the process of reflection within the prayer? Or would you say that's something more within du'as or other techniques that you're meant to use in terms of your self-reflection?
I think for many people it is part of the salah, and it's acceptable as that. The thinking that's not acceptable in the salah is self-indulgent thinking about lesser things. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, call upon me in the salah. And the time we offer du'as is in the qunut. And at other points, for instance, in the seating of the final rakat of any set, we offer du'a. What are we asking for? I mean, if you really need a car, I would say that's the point you say, and by the way, Lord, I really need a car to do my business. This will bring me spiritual peace, take away a worry from me. So we've got this attitude amongst some scholars saying you can't think about worldly things, but sometimes worldly things are spiritual things. So the advice is it's better not to think about worldly things, but if you have to ask for something, ask during the salah.
Well, this is again striking at our attitudes to religious freedom. Religious freedom is really a right. We're talking about a right of a human individual.
We may look at right in two ways. A Western thinker will say it's a human right. As a Muslim and a scholar, I say it's a God-given right, one of his ni'amat privileges for mankind. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you choose, I'll trust you that far. It's not something that occurs because of the chemistry of the ground. This is something that is granted to us as a power. And so the concept of rights and duties and the discussion between Islam and other schools of thought we have to say, for us, this goes beyond just something that we claim as a right. This is something that is declared a right by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
So it's something which is divinely gifted.
Very serious business.
Sure.
If I may come in on that and just say that really the question of duties that correspond naturally to rights has not come up in the Western discourse really until now. Only now we've just ourselves had a conference which Sheikh Amin was at about religious freedom and responsibility rather than just the rights. Now, of course, a secularist would say those duties can be called forth from even atheists on the basis of civic virtue or whatever, but as the Sheikh says, believers will always say this is rooted in the sense of the sacred, that there is a sacred duty, as well as these rights that have been enshrined in documents at the United Nations.
And so how do we protect this this right to religious freedom? What's the challenge for modern day faith communities in trying to preserve those rights? And I mean, perhaps even before that question arises, what are the attacks on the rights of religious freedom? Can we define further obvious attacks which are going on? And I'm specifically thinking about secular society now. And in it, sometimes one gets the sense that secular society is very uncomfortable with faith-based society and is reacting in a way which is quite often unreasonable and perhaps over the top, especially with us living in the West. And the arrival of Islam and Muslims is a particularly new challenge, which is provoking particular reactions which were perhaps laid to rest given Christianity's accommodation of secularism and vice versa over a period of centuries. Suddenly we're confronted with this I guess, attitude of reactionary behavior from secular society. How do we now renegotiate religious freedom within the context of a secular society? Sheikh Amin first, and then from you, Robert, as well.
I want to first say that the secularist movement have stolen a flag, because they have stolen the sort of the patent on pragmatic social structure, where the end destination in this world of a faith like Islam is a well-ordered, efficient society, a pragmatic approach to the day-to-day running of society.
Okay.
That doesn't belong to secularism. We've got that. But if we take the West, the UK, our religious education in schools is set to a secularist agenda, and its purpose is not to teach religion, but to help children become good citizens in a secular society.
Sure.
And we now have a move that atheism should be taught under the claim that religious education teaches all forms of belief. But the actual methodology that is taught is an atheist agnostic approach. And so they now want to increase the emphasis on atheism and diminish anything that we talk about things like the moral imperative, about the spiritual side of life. And they want to ask our children at the age of 8, 9 or 10 to decide themselves whether they believe there is God or not.
Okay.
And the children think that they have a choice, a false freedom, because their freedom is best served by being allowed to learn what they're choosing between. But that choice is not given to our children.
Your thoughts on secularism and faith-based societies and the issue of religious freedom within that context?
Well, once again, I have to say I am just a backroom guy, really. I do not much more than post the latest news on religious freedom. But I think it's fair to say that the secularization hypothesis that the sociology of religion was talking about with great enthusiasm, 10 to 20 years ago, has now been largely discredited by the return of religion in a big way, not just globally, but within secular societies. And this is why, well, we have people joining us all the time now on our Facebook group. There's been a perceptible uptick of people interested. What is religious freedom about? How do we safeguard it? The ideas I might have are that we have to realize that really all forms of ideation, of thinking, are belief in a sense. So atheism certainly is a form of belief. Agnosticism itself is again, I mean, we are belief-making creatures. And unless we honor that in ourselves as a whole, secularists too, there is a kind of a Jacobinism, isn't there, at play. But they will try to claim this neutral ground, this sort of fulcrum point, and see off any return, as they imagine it, of absolutist modes of thinking. And after all, the history of the West is, of course, a very bloody one. We should never forget that. And Englishmen in particular cherish freedoms, individual freedoms, disproportionately, some might say. I always think it's useful to look at China. You have the ultimate consensus society there, but a tremendous outbreak of Christian house church phenomena. There's this, you have Falun Gong as well, of course, but Confucianism is indeed, an honorable creed, but there are those who will dissent from that. And Article 18 of the UN Charter is, I think, our gold standard in the present age of recognition of diversity, and the attempt to recognize that uniformity, social uniformity, was important in previous eras. But our creativity in facing the challenges that lie ahead is in the very diversity that in the past has sought to be crushed.
Well, that sounds to me like religion has grown up in many ways. If that's the hymn book from which faiths are singing now, in a way, that's a far cry from the evangelism of the past, perhaps, in both, say, Islamic terms or Christianity or many other faiths where evangelical faith has been the norm and used quite often in a way which was a creator of conflict, a creator of difficulties or conquest even. Sheikh, I mean, let's finish on this point, on this newfound maturity of faiths. Let's assume that faiths are now at a stage where they recognize each other's space and recognize the commonalities that exist among them, and recognize that the values that they hold within, I think, pretty much all faiths, you can say, the commonality of those values like generosity, hospitality, kindness, that these could be the fulcrum on which a united platform of believers, if you like, could make a significant impact on secular society and to genuinely come up with valid answers and questions, actually, in the first place, and answers in trying to ensure that secular society itself doesn't spin off in terms of suppressing freedoms of religious peoples.
Yeah, I think one of the important things I see is actually our differences. There's often an assumption that if we all appear to be the same, we become stronger. But actually our differences and the approaches we take to a belief in a God, in creation, give a new strength to arriving at that position. That we each of us bring with us a rational chain of reasoning of why we believe there is a God. And a lot of the atheistic and arguments against God are quite predictable and quite tired. And we find amongst people of religion vast variety of reasons why they believe, a vast variety of evidences, not necessarily empirical, but the body of anecdotal evidence and subjective evidence is overwhelming. So it's our differences I want to hear about. The second thing is, when we're looking at each other, Hadith tells us to wish for our brothers what we wish for ourselves. That's a prophetic hadith. And we also have, many other advices about who our brother is. Imam Ali alayhi salam, men are two sorts of brothers, either brothers in faith or brothers in humanity. So we have to look at people and find a method to understand what they need, what we wish for them. Now we can use, commonly it's said, use empathy, which is trying to imagine yourself into them. But I don't find this particularly adequate. What I recommend to my students when they're approaching other faiths, other people, is to use alienation upon themselves. Strip away your pretenses and see what remains, what's real, and then see what sympathises with the other human being, and develop connections through those, we could say, deconstructions, internal deconstructions. But I worry about the word deconstruction. I used it to a Baptist minister once, and he fell off the chair shouting, "My God, he's a postmodernist." So use it with care, brother.
Sure. Well, that's again for the layperson who's thinking about what is my role as a person of faith, and when I'm going out there and engaging with secular society or other faiths, what's the methodology that I use? You've touched on it a little there. And how do I maintain my religious freedom within a society where there seems to be increasingly a fear of faith, particularly in the Islamic context? How do they go about doing that?
If I can point out a really simple example that I'm sure most of our viewers have actually seen. Of course, Sir Thomas More, or St. Thomas More, was actually an oppressor of heretics in the Catholic Church. He wasn't a very nice person. But in the movie A Man for All Seasons, he has a great line when he's talking to his daughter. And he says, "In truth, I would defend the devil if he were charged, because in defending the devil, I defend my own rights." And this is what we should remember, that when we oppress somebody, we become oppressors and we damage our rights before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not a wise move.
That's a very profound quote there, and well worth thinking about. But Robert, your final word on this, the future of how people of faith can not only maintain their own religious rights and freedoms, but also how they can engage with people not of faith in a meaningful way, and actually also preserve their rights.
Right. I would like to say that I think for me, again, just from my personal experience of interfaith, I've been most impressed when people of faith talk about their faith, when they more or less, as it were, turn on the charm and this is a dimension of interfaith that is perhaps neglected. I'm not too sure, perhaps in some of our groups it happens. In Israel, for example, we have work going on there. There's a lot of sharing between young adults in particular, but the aspect, the sort of the ethnographic or anthropological aspect of a religion, all the custom, all the ritual, all the folk wisdom, the sayings, religion is in this vast storehouse. I think the kind of respect that religion deserves from secular people who don't have this, the people who lack the grounding in these centuries of tradition that are to be found in the world faiths, that sort of lack in them needs to be brought in front of them by people of faith. And they cannot but be charmed, I think, by this dimension of religion. If you dwell too much on doctrine and truth and trying to, rhetorically persuade people or engage current issues from the perspective of religion, I think you're going to alienate a lot of people who just have shut religion out of the modern world picture. What they often don't realize is that modern culture is relatively sterile, I think. You're taught religious education in schools, but I'm not sure that it's taught very well. And there is just so much depth in religion that it can't really be taught in that way. It's something that can happen in social exchange of believers with those who have been perhaps deprived of the benefits of a religious background.
Well, the topic was never going to be concluded within one session, but I thank you, gentlemen, for giving a stab, and we've done very well in terms of mapping perhaps some of the intra-religious problems of freedom that we sometimes try and negate amongst each other. And then, of course, on an inter-religious basis, there's also sometimes the tendency to negate other people's rights. And we've broadened out the discussion to faith communities and their relationship to secular society and the limitations of the freedom of faith and freedom of religion in the modern 21st century context. So it's clearly a vast topic. We could have broken down the social elements to this, the political elements, the economic elements around religious freedom, and perhaps in future programs I'll invite you back to pick on particular areas and to have another go at breaking down even more in a more detailed way some of those factors which hinder religious freedom, or some of the factors that people ascribing to religious freedom cause to the rest of society. But thank you for joining us on this discussion. Join us again for Faith to Faith next week, same time. Assalamu alaikum. Khuda Hafiz.